Can you imagine a year where summer just never shows up? Seriously, no warm, sunny days. Instead, you get frost in June, rain that never seems to stop, and this weird, gloomy twilight all day long. Well, that's not fiction. That is exactly what happened in 1816. So let's dive into one of the most bizarre and catastrophic moments in history.
Our story kicks off, believe it or not, with a vacation that went completely sideways. Picture this. We're at a fancy villa on Lake Geneva in Switzerland. You've got a group of young, brilliant, and, let's be honest, very dramatic English writers. And they're all trapped inside, just staring out at this miserable, stormy weather day after day. One of them is a teenager named Mary Godwin.
See, here's the thing. What Mary and her famous friends had no idea about was that their terrible summer wasn't just a bit of bad luck. Nope. It was the direct consequence of a massive, cataclysmic event on the other side of the world. And that connection, well, it would go on to change literature and the world itself forever.
All right, so let's get back to that group of writers in Switzerland stuck indoors thanks to this relentless, gloomy rain.
I mean, this was the A-list of the romantic literary scene. You had Lord Byron, Percy Shelley, and Mary Godwin, who we now know as Mary Shelley. So what do you do when you're incredibly bored and stuck inside? Well, if you're Lord Byron, you make a challenge. You say, all right, everyone, let's see who can write the best ghost story. Percy Shelley gives it a shot, doesn't get very far. Byron scribbles down a little fragment. But Mary has what she called a waking dream one night. And from that nightmare, she comes up with the story of a scientist who creates life and creates a monster. And just like that dreary, miserable summer gave us Frankenstein. So, while Mary Shelley was busy creating one of the most iconic fictional monsters of all time, the real monster behind this whole story was lurking half a world away.
We have to rewind just a bit to the year before, April of 1815. On the island of Sumbawa, in what's now Indonesia, a volcano named Mount Tambora erupted. And look, this wasn't just any eruption. This was the largest volcanic explosion in over 10,000 years.
This quote is from the British governor at the time. The first explosions were so unbelievably loud they could be heard hundreds and hundreds of miles away. People thought it was a war, that they were hearing cannon fire. I mean, think about that. They had absolutely no frame of reference for a sound that huge. It just shows you how much confusion and chaos there was. Nobody knew what was going on.
The volcano just unleashed a staggering amount of material. We are talking about 160 cubic kilometers of rock, ash, and dust shot straight up into the atmosphere.
Now, I know 160 cubic kilometers is a hard number to wrap your head around, so let me put it this way. That's enough stuff to cover the entire United Kingdom, all of it, from Scotland down to Cornwall, in 1.5 feet of volcanic debris. It's an absolutely insane amount of material.
Okay, so here's the big question, right? How on earth does a volcano erupting in Indonesia cause snow in New England and inspire one of the greatest Horner novels of all time in Switzerland? It sounds wild, but the science is actually pretty straightforward. You can basically think of it like this. Mount Tambora gave the entire planet a chemical sunblock that it never asked for. All that rock and ash was bad enough, but the real troublemaker was a huge amount of sulfur gas that was blasted way, way up into the stratosphere.
So once it's way up there in the stratosphere, that sulfur gas mixes with water vapor and forms this incredibly fine mist of sulfate particles, or aerosols. This mist creates a kind of veil that wraps around the entire globe, and it acts like a giant mirror, reflecting sunlight back out into space before it can reach us and warm the planet. The result? A massive global cooling event.
On average, temperatures around the world dropped by as much as 3 degrees Celsius. Now I know, 3 degrees might not sound like a lot, but for the global climate system, that is a gigantic, catastrophic shift. And for a world that was almost completely dependent on agriculture, well, it was an absolute disaster.
This sudden plunge in temperature hit a world that was already fragile, just starting to recover from decades of war in Europe. This climate shock didn't just push the world to the edge, it shoved it right over, into a whole series of crises.
The dominoes started to fall, and they fell fast. First, crops failed everywhere. That led directly to massive famines and, of course, food riots. The economic shockwaves triggered depressions. And out of all that chaos, the perfect conditions emerged for new diseases and even new global economies to form.
In Europe, already devastated by the Napoleonic Wars, the failed harvests were catastrophic. People were starving.
Across the Atlantic, in North America, they called 1816 1800 and froze to death. There was literally snow in Vermont in June. The constant crop failures in the east pushed a huge wave of people to migrate westward, just looking for a new start. And all that economic turmoil eventually boiled over into the Panic of 1819, which was America's first major financial depression.
And the effects just kept spreading. Over in Bengal, the disruption to the climate changed the monsoon patterns. This created the perfect environment for a new, much deadlier strain of cholera to mutate and emerge. That one change sparked the world's first global cholera pandemic, which would go on to kill tens of millions of people. At the same time, in China's Yunnan province, the cold and the rain led to a 3-year famine. When traditional crops like rice kept failing, desperate farmers turned to the only thing that seemed to grow in the miserable conditions, the opium poppy. That single decision turned the entire region into a global hub for opium production, setting off a crisis with consequences that would last for more than a century.
So let's recap. We've got famine, disease, economic collapse, and the birth of Frankenstein's monster. It's a pretty dark picture. But the Tambora eruption left one more, very strange, and in a way, almost beautiful legacy.
It turns out, those very same sulfur particles in the atmosphere that were blocking the sun and causing all this suffering also had a really weird effect on light. They started creating some of the most spectacular, vibrant, and eerie sunsets the world had ever seen.
And you can actually see this in the art from the period. Painters like J.M.W. Turner became famous for his moody, dramatic skies filled with these intense, fiery reds and oranges. And here's the amazing part. He wasn't just being artistic or exaggerating for effect. He was, without even knowing it, accurately documenting the chemistry of the sky above him. He was painting the aftermath of a volcano.
And all of this just leaves you with this one kind of profound question. We tend to think of history as a story about people, about kings and queens, about wars and big ideas. But 1816, the year without a summer, shows us that sometimes the biggest events, from the birth of a literary monster to the start of a global pandemic, can all be traced back to the weather. Sometimes, history is just a story about the planet having a very, very bad year.